Well, hello and welcome to Dig Deeper. After quite a bit of a break over the Easter period, we are back and we are finishing over the next few weeks our series in Ephesians, and it's lovely to have back joining us as
again.
ever our long-term friend.
Long-suffering,
long-suffering Dr. Stephen Backhouse. Stephen, it's lovely to see the sun shining through your
I know. I
shed.
hope it's not distracting to you, but there you are.
No.
You might see some birds fluttering by. They haven't flown in yet, but sometimes they try.
How picturesque.
Yeah.
How picturesque. Well, it's Stephen, it's great to have you here. We are looking, of course, at Ephesians, and we paused, as I said, for a few weeks, but we're rejoining it as we did on Sunday. And we're looking now at the passages that talk about how we are to organize our lives, particularly our relational lives. But I wonder, Stephen, whether it's worth giving a bit of a refresh about some of the context that's leading into it.
Yeah, I mean, where would the context be? I guess the context would be that the Ephesians are a group of either it's probably a largely Gentile group, but definitely with there's going to be Jews and Gentiles together. They're going to the city of Ephesus is a well-known Roman, rich Roman city. It's well known for secret societies. It's well known for magic. It's well known. It has a lot of money. It has a lot of idols. It's seen as like a center point for ideas and as well as for power.
Okay.
So it's a very powerful place. So a lot of Ephesians is in some ways about how to deal with power and how to set aside your the sort of groups you were born into and the expectations that come with that and what it means to then be united into a new group. So Paul is doing work on trying to get people to unwean themselves from the bad habits that they were born into when it came to being rich Ephesians or exiled Jews or Gentiles, living on the outskirts of the Roman Empire. Whatever it is that they're born into, that has laid claim on their identity. He's now trying to figure out a new way of forging a new people. So there's a lot of conversation going on with these different sorts of groups. So he'll appeal to Jewish thought, or he'll appeal to Gentile thought, or he'll appeal to cultural norms that they all understand, and then he'll subvert it, or he'll say, this is the way you were taught, but this is the way we're going to live now. So, which is particularly pertinent to what we're going to talk about in a moment.
Yeah. And I mean, of our journey through Ephesians, of course, he outlines our theological, our spiritual identity. That's how he starts, doesn't he? He says, you are seated at the right hand.
Right. And yes, because it's all powers and principalities. So all of those things I've described, all of those rules of life that you're born into and blind habits that you just follow as a matter of course, or social institutions or nationalities or empires or synagogues, the catch-all term for all of those things are principalities. They're invisible forces that govern your life.
Yeah.
And Paul starts Ephesians by telling you that all the powers and principalities are put at Jesus's feet. They're put under him.
Yeah, okay.
And then he says, and you are co-rulers with Jesus. They're under your feet as well.
Yeah. Brilliant.
So a lot of Ephesians is about how to deal. And then when he talks about the spiritual life, he's in a way, that's what he's talking about. Like, you are no longer in the grip to invisible forces that govern your life. You get to command them, or you get to be on top of them.
Yeah. And there's very clearly an arc to his letter. I mean, this letter, as we know, wouldn't have just gone to the church in Ephesus. It probably would have gone to the whole region.
Yeah.
The arc goes from this is who you are in Christ. This is actually where all of our allegiances end up submitting to.
Yeah.
And then he says, and this is how you are to be with one another, that you lay down those identities as Jew and Gentile, whatever those kind of things that you cling tightly onto, and you form a new thing. You create a new community, a new order of doing things. So in the chapters leading up to this, there's a lot of talk around unity, a lot of talk about working together, a lot of talk about what maturity means so if we are going to come together, actually there are challenges with that. We're not always going to get everything right. There are, please he's saying, please behave well, please speak the truth in love, please be gentle to one another, please, stop brawling at one point, he says. And so he's moved us from kind of a theoretical, this is who you are, as in a kind of theological, spiritual sense, to this is how it really works when you're in community together. It's almost like he goes from the big ideas to the kind of big but smaller ideas, and now he's moving into more
how it works. Let's start at the cosmic level, and now how's it going to work out in our actual daily life together? Right.
And of course, the kind of the smallest understood unit of society is actually not the individual but the family, which is where he now, for Romans that was the case. Every political big historical movement or growth has understood the importance of the family unit.
Well, should we start? Do you want to read it?
Yeah, we'll go into that. So that's the context where we're at right now. I'll read it. Cool. We're looking at Ephesians chapter 5, and we are beginning at verse 21. And I will read this from the Kingdom New Testament, which is N.T. Wright's translation. And I'll read this for us now. Be subject to one another out of reverence for the Messiah. Wives, be subject to your own husbands as to the Lord. The man, you see, is the head of the woman, just as the Messiah too is head of the church. He is himself the savior of the body. But just as the church is subject to the Messiah, in the same way, women should be subject in everything to their husbands. Husbands, love your wives, as the Messiah loved the church and gave himself for it, so that he could make it holy, cleansing it by washing with water through the word. He did this in order to present the church to himself in brilliant splendor, without a single spot or blemish, or anything of the kind, that it might be holy and without blame. That's how husbands ought to love their own wives, just as they love their own bodies. Someone who loves his wife loves himself. After all, nobody ever hates his own flesh. He feeds it and takes care of it, just as the Messiah does with the church, because we are parts of his body. That's why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two become one flesh. The hidden meaning in this saying is very deep, but I'm reading it as referring to the Messiah and the church. Anyway, each one of you must love your wife as you love yourself, and the wife must see that she respects her husband.
Good. And do you want to talk about the parents and children as well?
Yes. Let's do that as well. That's the passage I read we addressed on Sunday. We're going to tackle 2 in 1 today. But you're right. Chapter 6 then continues. Children, obey your parents in the Lord. This is right and proper. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment that comes with a promise attached, so that things may go well with you and that you may live a long life on earth. Fathers, don't make your children angry. Bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord.
Great.
And then we go into slaves and masters.
And we'll do masters and bondservants and all that next week.
In another session. So we're going to pause there.
They're all connected, by the way. The masters and bondservant is also, it's all about households. So
exactly.
It's all part of the same thing. All right, so I don't know what you preached on. I mean, I didn't hear your sermon, so I don't know if we're going to be at odds or in agreement or what.
Oh, it'll be interesting. Yeah,
it is a completely, the first thing you have to say is in terms of context, like us reading it today, we've been shaped by a context, and the context is basically this kind of patriarchy where these passages have been used as clobber passages to subjugate women and to enforce male superiority. Yeah. And so it's hard. I would say, you know what? It might be almost impossible to read these texts fresh, actually, because they've done so much damage to people. And I think we have to acknowledge that right from the start.
Yeah. Well, certainly the way they've been used. And
they've been used to, yeah.
Yeah. And I think, but also the flip side of that is that we, particularly in our current, liberalization of our world, that we also hear it with that we actually kind of, I joked on Sunday as I was preaching, but as I got some way through and I was repeating one of the verse, and I had to say out loud in my sermon, is anybody sweating yet?
Yeah, right,
Maybe it's just me, because we hear what it sounds like. We hear how this comes across. So there is obviously the historic misuse of this passage in lots of ways.
Yeah.
And some of it, not just misuse, but abuse. But also we hear it in that very difficult current Twitter kind of liberal climate that, most of us are in the West particularly, where we can't even say these words out loud, A, because of the baggage of the history that they carry, but B, because even if you, as best as you can, take all that history out of it, just simply taking this passage at face value feels very challenging.
Well, can we go to a headline then? So I always like to speak in headlines and then color in. I'll draw the lines first and then we can color it in later. But I think the headline here is summed up by verse 21, famously. Everyone submit one to another.
Right.
And what we've got here is in modern language, we would say, if you have some rights, this is how, don't clutch tightly to your own rights, figure out a way to enhance someone else. Okay. So a lot of it is about laying down your privilege or using the privilege that the society has invested in you, using it for others and not for yourself.
Yeah.
All right. So you might be invested with power and privilege because you were just born the right color or the right social class or whatever. The right, I'm using with air quotes. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Through no work of your own, you have this power. Now, this is how we use it. This is how Jesus people use the power that they've got. And also an attitude towards whether you should be grasping for that kind of power, the worldly power and status, or whether, what is our orientation towards power?
Yeah.
And I think that's probably sums up all of these passages. Actually, he's not actually talking about gender roles, by the way, not actually talking about family organization. The whole book is talking about power and how you use it. And this is one example. Like the family this isn't the climax of the book.
No.
This is one example of many ways to use power and to think about power.
Yeah. And I think Paul throws it. It's almost like Paul gets distracted because he's like, right at the very end, he says, certainly in my translation, it says the hidden meaning in this saying is very deep, but I'm reading it referring to the Messiah in the church.
Yeah.
Anyway, each one of you must love your wife. It's like, Oh, by the way, I got distracted, and so I'm going to write this down. So,
I mean, because you probably know about the wider kind of cultural context. You probably did you talk about Aristotle and
so on Sunday I talked, well, I did some work around the geographical setting of Ephesus, so actually you talked earlier about Ephesus being a very important cosmopolitan town in the Roman Empire, but actually its history predating the Roman Empire was Greek, and it was the most important city in the Greek world, and so we have to understand that for hundreds of years, Greek philosophers like Aristotle said that there were certain ways in which the household was to be organized. The family unit was the most important unit in human society. So if you get that right, you can that multiplies out.
It's a genre. There's a literary genre, and it's called the household codes.
Yeah.
Ophniensis. And Aristotle had a famous one, and other Greeks did. And they always addressed this is how you order your household. And they always addressed it to the most powerful person, right? To the man.
Yeah.
And this is how you do it, right? And so Paul is just doing that. He's using that same genre. It's a genre everyone would have recognized. So what's interesting is where he subverts the expectation, right? What you point out here is whereas Aristotle and everything is always applying it to the men. This is how you should organize your wives. This is how you should organize your children. This is how you should organize your bondservants. Paul addresses the bondservants. Paul addresses the children. Paul addresses the women. It's different. It looks very different.
Yeah.
To what, if you are familiar with the genre of household codes, then you notice that Paul is doing something quite different. He's actually he's elevating everybody in that household to some level of moral agency. That you have a role to play as well. You have a choice here. This is how we deal with the choices that we've got. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's that's what I was trying to, draw out on Sunday, is that he's not expecting the people of this new community, this new citizenship in a new kingdom that he's been talking about for chapters in Ephesians, to somehow isolate themselves off into some new community that he's using the terminology that they would already be familiar with and turning it on its head. It was revolutionary.
This is the other headline, is that we have been trained by centuries of this kind of stuff to think that it's conservative.
No, it's absolutely
It's not at all conservative. And in fact, the people, when they saw Christians, they thought they actually called them atheists. They thought they were like radical atheists. They're like, you are so outside of the way we normally think. We don't even have a category for you.
Yeah.
And the way that women were empowered and had voices, and the way that children were empowered and had voices, and the way that bond servants were empowered and had voices in these Christian households was so scandalous. People did not look at Paul and the Ephesians and say, oh, there's a conservative upholder of traditional family values. That is not what you have to know. That even if you don't feel it when you read this, you have to know that.
Well, and I heard somebody describe once.
Yeah, they said that Paul is 2,000 years behind us, but 100 years ahead of everyone else in his time, right?
Yeah.
And have you heard this before? I described it as like do you remember the old vacuum? Do you remember television sets, the old vacuum tube television sets? Yeah. Where when you turned it on, it didn't come on right away.
Yeah.
The picture didn't. It was always a little dot, and then it would slowly expand. Yeah. And I've heard somebody describe these kind of passages like that. They're like, pay attention here. It was a feminist theologian I was reading, and she used this analogy. She's like, pay attention here. Like, what you're seeing in these passages, not a full-fledged social practice of liberation, but you are seeing the little light that is slowly expanding, and it's going to take a while, but it does expand. But this is the beginning of This is the beginning of a new way of thinking about social relationships, and a lot of it has to do, like I said, with that submission, which is, if you have power, this is how you use it. And notice that way more attention is spent on how men are supposed to use their power than on anyone else.
Yeah.
And it's all about laying down your life, right? It's all about, like, so when it says wives submit, so the word term, because Paul's going to, in Ephesians 6, he's going to talk about putting on the armor of God.
Yeah.
He's going to subvert and make fun of Roman military terms. He's doing it here as well. Submit is a military term for, think of like that imagery of all these Roman soldiers, with their shields and their swords, and they're all in a phalanx, and they're all in this really good order. Well, now imagine one of those soldiers at the end of the row. His shield is askew and his spear is sticking out the wrong way and his hat is on sideways, right? The commander would point to that soldier and he'd say, soldier, submit yourself. Soldier, like, get in. It has the idea, it has to do with like shalom, like you're out of place. That part of you is out of place with the whole.
Okay.
And the idea is like, gather yourself. Get a grip on yourself, I guess is the word we might use, right?
Yeah.
So the word submission doesn't mean become a cringing worm or become nothing or become a doormat. It means gather yourself. Don't be a power unto your own self, because there's other people around you. You're part of something bigger than just you.
Yeah,
so
nice.
Check yourself before you wreck everyone else.
Okay? Yeah, got it.
So that's submission. So in fact, it actually assumes that you have power. So rather than submission assuming you are powerless, it assumes the opposite. It's like you have power, and right now your power is affecting other people around you.
Yeah.
So use it well. So Paul says, submit everyone, check yourself. Look to the other people around you.
Yeah.
Okay. Wives, submit to your husband. And then he uses the head language, which is like the idea that again, shalom, like it isn't like so much about leadership, but about just health, the health of the body. Okay. I think it's time for a break, don't you?
All right, let's do that. We'll be back in a moment. I did a lot of reading around kephale, which is the word for head. And there was some debate about whether a head could be read in a way that says authority, or, because I think we come to that translation. I think the translators, this is one of those passages where translation is really important, and understanding, even down to the way that our NIVs are set out. Doesn't happen in NT Wright's because he doesn't use subheadings in the same way. But even the submit to one another is separate in our NIVs. Like the subheading interrupts that. And so if you just come to it fresh, you go, wives, submit to your husbands. Well, actually, you need to submit to one another first. That sets the context. That's the headline, as you said.
Yeah.
But the same goes for the word head. We hear head as in head of department, the head of the company, the head coach, the head, the boss, the one who gets the final say, the one who gets his own way. We hear that all the time. And so when we come in and says the man is the head of the wife, or the husband is the head of the wife, we read it with that lens. But that word kephale, I did some work around it, and some would want to maybe look at it as meaning origin or source, which Paul talks about in different places in Corinthians and so on, because he refers back to the narrative in Genesis, the creation narrative that talks about, woman had been created out of man. It's the source of. Right. Yeah. But it's interesting that the way where I landed is that doesn't actually help us. And interesting, Anthony Thistleton, who actually taught me at Nottingham, who wrote significant number of commentaries. He talks about that actually doing a word study on kephale actually doesn't help you. He said there's no point trying, because it doesn't. You need to see it in the whole. So you can't just pick the word out and examine it in kind of upside down, inside out. Okay. You have to kind of look at it in the whole. And where I landed was actually Paul gives us a clue as to what it means for the husband to be the head of the wife, in that he says, as the Christ is the head of the church. And how is Christ the head of the church? Then I referred us as a congregation to Philippians 2. And this talks about power, right?
Yeah, right.
So how is Christ the head of the church? Well, he says, may your attitude be as that of Christ Jesus, who made himself nothing, taking the nature of a servant. And so essentially where I landed, and I don't know what you think about this, because we've not talked about it other than in this moment, is that actually for the husband to be the head of the wife is essentially to be the chief servant, to be the one that submits the most, even unto death. Like he's the one that relinquishes the most power. It's not about getting the final say or having his own way. Right. Yeah. It's about saying, I'm going to be okay if I never get what I want.
Well, that's the subversion. That's what I'm talking about here with this household codes, because Paul isn't inventing the idea that wives should submit to husbands. He's not inventing the idea that the husband is the head of the household, right? Like that's an idea that everyone already assumes. He's just wet, sky is blue, right? So when people hear that, they're not thinking this is new stuff.
No.
What's new is when he's saying, all right, men, you're the head. We all know you're the head of the family. That's what our world tells us. Now I want you to die for them. Now I want you to lay down your life. In fact, with the children, he's going to say, essentially, I want you to submit to your children. Because at the end, he says, fathers, do not. And then the word, I don't know what Tom Wright has, but it can be described as like thwart. Do not frustrate. Do not thwart your children. Yeah. Because it was like a father's right to control his children's destiny, right? And here Paul is like, fathers, don't control your children's destiny. Essentially, submit to what they want, right? This is another example of submission. And so you just kind of get this idea that's like, okay, men, fine, you're the head of the household. Well, what does that look like? Don't look to what Romans think being head of a household looks like. Look to what Jesus thinks being a head of something means. And it means laying down your life, being a servant to all. Like, so there is something going on here. He's using the language, but then he's giving the opposite example.
Yes.
And again, like if you read this as just a conservative rubber stamping of patriarchy, you're missing something that would not have been missed by the earliest readers of this text. Yeah. They would have really seen this as like, and that submission is not a bad thing. It's the thing that Jesus does. He submitted to death, even death.
Absolutely. And it's not, you're not submitting to tyranny.
No.
That's why I read a commentary that talks about submission is not, I submit my life every day to Christ and I don't see it as a tyranny. So when we submit to one another and it is mutual submission, we don't see that as a tyranny, but as a something of joy giving, of worship, it's a gift.
Yeah. And then you love, and then also it becomes like not just spiritual, it becomes like practical as well. It's like husbands, when you love your wives, it's as if you're loving your own body. You're loving yourself, which is now elevating the wife not to a position of property anymore. It's like, oh, right, she's an actual human being in this relationship.
Yeah.
There is more going on here. Than simply reinforcing some sort of power dynamic. It's actually a leveling. It's trying to level everybody.
Yeah.
And we know that in effect, that is what happened, right? We know that women did have positions of authority, public positions of authority in the church. We know that this is happening. And so, and they had reputations the Christian households had reputations for being unruly and unmanaged according to the way of the world, because everybody had a voice, for example.
One of the interesting things that I wasn't able to draw out because of time is that only the husbands are required to love, according to this passage. Wives are not asked to love their husbands. And again, that kind of points to the fact that, and I wasn't able to draw this out, but in a society where the arranged marriage was quite a thing, that actually choosing to love is a choice, and that is the husbands are asked to love because that is the choice that happens. Interestingly, I read later that Clement of Alexandria, a few hundred years later, decided that actually it's quite important for wives to love their husbands too. So, which is quite a relief for us all.
You know how I really love, there's this theologian I love named Sarah Coakley. She's Cambridge. She's in America now, but she's British, and she was at Cambridge for a long time. She's an Anglican priest. But Sarah Coakley is, if you read about, she's interesting talking about this stuff. She has a really good book called Powers and Subversions, and she has a whole chapter on submission, actually. And one of her points is, she's like, yes, these passages are used. Nobody's going to argue that these passages haven't been used, by men to keep women in place. Yes, let's all agree that happens. However, if you go back to a little bit more, that it's not about, if you think about it, it's not about Paul saying this is how men should act to women. This is how you should act when you have power and privilege. And Sarah Coakley points out, she's like, that is still relevant to us today. And Sarah Coakley says, like, I'm a woman who was born into a position of power and privilege. I'm a Cambridge academic. I'm a member of a certain social class. I've got all these privileges to me. I can read these texts as an example of how to use the power and privilege I was born into that I didn't do anything to get, and now I own, right? So you can start to see that underlying this is not think about gender roles. It's about power and what to do with power and how to approach the power.
Yeah.
So she's able to read these texts and see them as, it might have even been her who had that image, by the way, of the television set opening up. Come to think of it.
Okay.
But you can see these texts. She's like, there's something going on here that is useful to me as a powerful white woman, and that the power that comes to me in this situation I'm in right now, actually, I can hold that lightly. I can figure out what it means to submit. So, I do find that there is something fruitful going in that direction. If you still think these texts have any use to us today, it's probably going to be more along those lines than along the lines of like setting out unchanging gender roles. Yeah.
And I think it's a helpful reminder, as you did at the beginning and bringing us back to now, that setting it in the context of powers and principalities, that this is not just here, it's all the way through. And as we eventually end on actually powers and principalities in the spiritual realm, we're going to be landing on that.
Yeah, exactly.
That kind of ties it together.
Yeah.
And it's helpful as we finish off Ephesians over the next few weeks to have that as our predominant lens, that which Paul is trying to set up and help us see the world differently in that way. Stephen, thank you for an amazing dig deeper as we return. Looking forward to seeing you next week when we'll look at slaves and masters, is in my translation, bond servants, as you talked about.
Yeah.
And one which is, again, one of those passages that you kind of think, well, I really want to get my teeth into that, which we'll do all next week. Stephen, thanks for joining us.
Good. Thanks, John. Bye, everyone.
Have a wonderful week. Take care.